Good morning, said Dr. Peterson on the communication screen. I see you survived Galvo's trained assassin. Good. I tried to warn you but I couldn't get through. I imagine you were. He tried to muster a playfully scolding tone to hide the seething envy that boiled inside him, otherwise occupied, shall we say? Anyway, you'll have to brace yourselves, because Galvo has engineered a lightning storm which will dangerously turbulate your flight in approximately 4 seconds. On the side of the plane you'll find some special high-tech guns and nuclear quark torpedoes which I recently installed in CA-. Then the screen crackled out. Dr. Peterson, shouted Horace. But there was no reply. The signal was interrupted by the horrendous lightning storm which now frothed and exploded in apocalyptic terror all around them. With a horrible wrench the plane was rent in twain by a sickly hand of grisly lightning. "No!" shouted Horace as almost half of his girlfriends fell into the ocean without any parachutes because all they were wearing was their underwear. Just then, a squadron of fighter jets surrounded the half-plane and started firing machine guns and missiles at it. Horace's remaining girlfriends manned the side planes Dr. Peterson had told them about. They fired back at the fighter jets and then that problem was solved. Horace shot down a few with his pistol as well. The storm abated. Horace sank to his knees and cried noble tears over the freezing cold deaths of half of his girlfriends. The rest of his Slavic beauties comforted him, and told him they'd finally landed in Antarctica. Horace took heart and stood up. "Right," he said in a commanding tone. "Time to put on our winter gear and set off for the very center of this wretched, God-forsaken excuse for a continent." He put on a fur hat and goggles and a leather jacket and boots and took a huge swig of peppermint schnapps. His girlfriends put on furry boots and coats. They didn't complain, for they were blessed by the ovular face of Mother Mary who strengthened their hearts with a manly chorus of Orthodox music which struck fire into their harsh Russian muscles and gave them holy courage for the long trek ahead. They knew in their hearts that their Eastern European sisters had drowned to the bottom of the ocean to be carrion for glowing sea vipers and the like, but they soldiered on with their straight noses and angry eyebrows and sharp teeth, digging poles of high-tech steel into the ice and marching forward, into certain death. "Come on," howled Horace over his shoulder, "we're almost there." Indeed, he could see the electromagnetic force field of nuclear essence throbbing round the very center of the South Pole. Around it sprung a fearsome wall of fire, which he knew to be from the bowels of hell itself. And lo, Horace Clamsauce and his Slavonic blood bride staggered ever forward, and reached the edge of this terrible ring of flame. "Well," said Horace, "I guess this is what they mean when they say walking through fire." Even though his joke really made no sense, his girlfriend's brains were now so adversely affected by the cold that they somehow imagined it into the most brilliant joke of all time, and even through the heavy layers of winter clothing they managed a final carnal congregation. And then, with nothing else to do, no thought in their resolute, virtuous minds, they marched straight through the fiery blast of the wall which sprang through the icy rock of the Antarctic, all the way through the Earth's mantle and finally from the deepest furnaces of hell itself. And, oh, the cold had been one thing, but nothing in their long lives had ever prepared them for the scorching pain which now raged all over their clothes and burrowed into their skin. How their ancestors rejoiced to see their valor, whilst also lamenting that their descendants should endure such undeserved hell fire. Finally Horace and a couple dozen of his women made it through to the other side. He almost dropped to the ground to put out the flame in the snow, but then he noticed he was teetering upon the brink of the moat full of walruses. He steadied himself by flapping his arms around and realized there was nowhere he could put out the flame. It was such a narrow stretch from the firewall to the moat. "Oeg!" cried he, for he felt deep sadness in his heart and wondered if this might be the certain death mission which would in fact send him to his grave. But looking from side to side at his bombshell action friends, he took heart, for even as the flames continued to consume their taut Eurasian skin, and oily sweat dripped sexily from their tangled hair as their clothes burned off, he could see that their righteous souls were steadfast in their determination to complete this mission, that the world's coinage should be brought back to normal and the world not suffer a devastating collapse. They dared not look back to their collapsing, shrieking comrades, for they knew that the Lord in his mercy would save their souls from the fire, even if not their lives. Any ideas, he husked wittily, and his companions, his last top layer falling apart in burnt crisps to reveal his hulking ripped hunks of undulating muscle. We could try jump on their backs, but will be hard to climb up the other side, Nitishka said, struggling with English and the pain of the fire which ate away at her pants. Or we could form bridge with all us together to there, said Ralunya. She was completely naked now, and despite a little fire still in her hair, and drizzling hot coals sliding down her shining body, it seemed the worst of the infernal torment was over for her. Great idea, shouted Horace. And so he knelt down and all too eagerly let Ralunya stand on his shoulders, then more climbed on until finally all 24 of them were standing on top of each other in a human tower. All right, yelled Horace, hang on. He fell forward, toward the moat, and caught the edge with his toes to keep them all from falling in. They all managed to hold onto each other, even while falling in a straight line across the moat. Emanovnikha, at the other end, the very top end of the tower, now grabbed hold of the other side. Okay, she cried, now what do we do? Said Horace, well, I guess. Let's see, how about Nubushka can climb over you and Unchka, you keep holding onto Nubushka. That will of course pull me from my grip on this side, and by extension drop my end into the moat. But I think if we just keep climbing over each other, some of us might make it. That is good idea, called Nubushka, and she did as she was told. Horace braced himself as his toes slid from the edge, and he fell into the icy, walrus-infested moat, holding for dear life onto Rolunya's ankles. Walruses closed in around him. He kicked them and called for his girlfriends to hurry along, but it was slow going. Suddenly, a walrus caught him by his leg in its gleaming fangs. Ugh! Horace screamed, his hands slipping off Rolunya's charred feet. Horace, she called, concerned for the man who she loved more than any other. Horace thrashed about in mortal combat with the terrible walruses in the freezing cold water. His girlfriends screamed and wept as more and more walruses swarmed about him, their cold blue eyes glowing with evil menace. Horace punched them and strangled them, even after one of them dragged its slashing tusks across his chest and left a sick-ass wound of slashes on his chest. Ow! Thundered Horace. He killed the rest of the walruses with his bare hands and then climbed up the slope to the other side of the moat with his bare hands. Exhausted, he dropped to the ground and took deep breaths, and his girlfriends cried and cursed the fates that they should so befoul a man so strong and valiant as their Horace. They were also naked and shivering and soaking wet, but Horace still had his pants on. Finally, Horace stood up, and said, "There's no time to rest. We must defeat Galvo before he melts all the world's currency into." He lifted an eyebrow and every facet of his visage emitted that a jest was about to burst forth. Liquid assets. This time that the steppe Amazons jumped our heroes' bones, it was with even more intense, bittersweet poetic savage passion than they'd even had on the beach in Brazil. For they knew now that there was no hope, none whatsoever. And they'd all certainly die in the next few hours and never experience joy again for a million years. As they copulated in perfect rhythm, they reflected on the tragic beauty of the fact that it had taken millions and millions of years and struggling evolution to produce the finely tuned beautiful creatures they were, and that all too soon they would be gone forever, trying to save an unworthy world which would never know their names. They finished simultaneously, and Horace strode to the edge of the moat, flipped his hair and looked back out over the moat, through the firewall and out over the treacherous expanses of Antarctica. He lit a cigarette and took a contemplative drag, wondering about such sophisticated thoughts as the very nature of existence itself. Ralunya came up beside him, rested her long, elegant chin on his shoulder and held him by the arm. "What you think you would do if you actually would live through this?" she asked, with strong, passionate tears welling up in her eyes. "I guess. I don't know," said Horace, blowing out smoke and squinting his eyes into the horizon. I've never known any life but this. Suddenly, there was a terrible blast of sizzling electric currents from the central compound. Horace turned to face it and Ralunya reluctantly let go his arm. "Come on," said Horace, dropping the butt of his cigarette and putting it out under his boot as he marched away from the moat. "It's time for the final stretch." Horace's beautiful sidekicks followed him toward the compound. Their flesh was a little charred, just enough so that they were tough and angry looking but not gruesome. They still had their guns with them too. They reached the edge of the huge iron-gray compound. There was a giant door with a combination keypad next to it. "All right," said Horace, "now all we need to do is open this door." He immediately set to work trying out all 80,364 combinations until finally, 10 days later, he punched in the right one and they went inside. "Careful," said Horace as they all stalked through the dimly lighted metal hallway, "there are rats and fleas in here carrying Black Death. It's already in the air anyway, so there's not much we can do." Unfortunately, some fleas came in and infected Natalia and Ralunya with the Black Death. "No!" screamed Horace,